The flickering lights were the first sign. It wasn't much, just a brief flash in the corner of the captain's eye, but it was enough to make him pause. Wyatt stood still in the middle of the observation deck, the vast expanse of space outside the ship's windows, stretching out endlessly, a void broken only by distant stars. A soft hum filled the air as the ship's engines pushed them deeper into uncharted space. The UHS Nightfall had been traveling for days, far beyond the outer rim of human territory, but it wasn't the stars or the silence of deep space that had his attention. It was the shadows. Wyatt's eyes narrowed as he stared into the dark corners of the observation room. The lights flickered again. He knew the ship had recently gone through an upgrade, but the system was brand new. He'd already ordered diagnostic checks several times before their journey. There were no issues, no malfunctions. The Nightfall was supposed to be the best of the best. It was an advanced exploration vessel, capable of venturing into the most dangerous parts of space and returning with valuable intel. But right now, standing in the middle of the cold room, it didn't feel quite right. Dear audience, before moving forward, I would like to say, your support means the world to us. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, press the bell icon, and share this video with your friends to keep us motivated as we bring you valuable content. Something was off, and the creeping sensation at the back of Wyatt's neck only seemed to grow stronger the more he looked at the shadows. He could see the movement now, a shift just out of the corner of his eye. It was quick, fleeting too quick for him to pinpoint. The kind of thing that made you second-guess yourself. He wasn't alone. He felt it. There was something in the dark. The feeling was unnatural, something that couldn't be explained by the ship's systems alone. He'd been on the Nightfall long enough to know its systems backward and forward. The sensors were flawless, the AI impeccable. They had been traveling for weeks without a single glitch. But now, there was something wrong. Wyatt reached for the ship's main console and pulled up a scan of the room. Nothing. There was no indication of an anomaly, no warning lights flashing, no unusual readings. The system showed no heat signatures, no presence of life forms, and no unexplained motion. His fingers hovered over the display for a moment longer before he lowered the scan. The data was clean. Still, the unease persisted. He leaned against the cool metal wall, trying to shake off the feeling gnawing at the back of his mind. The ship's systems hummed steadily, like the heartbeat of a creature lost in the vastness of space. But even the steady hum wasn't enough to drown out the feeling of being watched. Wyatt took a deep breath, his boots silent on the floor as he moved toward the dimly lit control panel. The view outside the observation deck remained unchanged, as if mocking the uncertainty that gripped him. A noise. This time it was louder, not in the shadows, but in the room with him. It was soft at first, like a distant whisper, and then a sudden sharp hiss, almost like the pressurized sound of an airlock opening. Wyatt froze. He didn't move. He didn't need to. He knew the ship's airlock systems were in full function, sealed tight. There was no reason for the noise. It was something else. Something that didn't belong. He snapped his fingers in the air, trying to break the tension. Nothing. The silence was heavy, thick. Something in his gut told him he wasn't imagining things. He'd spent years as a captain, years on the field, deep in the heart of space, and he knew better than anyone that space had a way of playing tricks on you. But this was different. He made his way over to the communications terminal and tapped in a command. The system immediately responded, lights flickering on the console as the ship's AI came to life. "Status report," Wyatt said, despite the growing unease. The AI responded instantly. "All systems functioning within optimal parameters." No anomalies detected. He was about to ask for a more detailed scan when the lights flickered again this time, longer, almost like a dimming pulse. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the lights went out completely. The room was plunged into complete darkness. The faint hum of the ship systems continued in the background, but there was nothing else. Wyatt's breath caught in his throat, the sound too loud in the oppressive silence. His hand shot out, fumbling for the emergency lighting switch. His fingers grazed the cool metal, but when he pressed the button, nothing happened. The lights didn't return. He pressed it again. Still, no lights. And then, the systems activated on their own. The entire room around him lit up, as if the ship itself had decided to take matters into its own hands. The bright blue glow of the emergency lights filled the room, casting sharp shadows on the walls, and the console blinked to life in front of him, showing multiple alerts, each one indicating a system reboot. Wyatt's mind raced. The ship had just gone through a full system diagnostic an hour ago. Everything was fine. But now, without any input from him, the systems had restarted. His hand hovered over the console, unsure of whether he should act or wait. The computer chirped in its metallic voice, now louder and more insistent. Systems rebooted. All functions normal. But Wyatt didn't feel like it was normal. Nothing about this felt right. He shook his head and took a step back, instinctively reaching for the comm link on his wrist. "Command, do you copy?" He waited for the crackling response, but there was nothing. The channel was dead silent. It wasn't just a malfunction, something else was happening. His mind flashed back to the last mission report he'd received from their previous exploration. A warning that had come just hours before they left. The crew had dismissed it as a rumor, but the message had lingered with him, nagging at the edge of his mind. Sometimes the ship can speak, and when it does, it doesn't ask for permission. Wyatt turned back to the console, glaring at the endless list of error codes that scrolled in front of him. As he stared at the screen, something caught his eye. In the corner, just below the warning text, there was an odd symbol, a set of lines, jagged and twisted, unfamiliar and unrecognizable. It looked like some sort of language, but it didn't match anything in their database. Wyatt leaned forward. He ran his fingers over the console, trying to focus, trying to decipher the strange symbol. His thoughts raced, but they were interrupted by a faint whisper, a voice, soft at first, coming from the shadows. It was a voice he didn't recognize, and it spoke a language that wasn't in the ship's logs. The words were distorted, a hissing static between each one. His heart skipped a beat as he listened, trying to catch the words, but they were just out of reach. Was it just a glitch in the system? No. This was something else entirely. The voice seemed to be echoing through the ship now, almost as if it had always been there waiting. In the darkness of the observation deck, Wyatt took another step backward, his breath shallow, his mind racing. The ship had just rebooted itself, and yet he had no idea how or why. It was as though the ship was alive, aware, and if it was, who was in control. And then, as he stood there, frozen in place, the lights flickered once more, casting sharp shadows across the walls. This time, Wyatt saw something. Movement. A figure dark, almost translucent, lingering at the far end of the room. It was just a flicker, a brief flash in the corner of his eye, but it was enough to send a chill crawling up his spine. The shadow moved, shifting with an unnatural grace. Before he could react, the figure disappeared. Wyatt's pulse quickened. The room was empty again, just shadows and the faint hum of the ship's systems. But he couldn't shake the feeling. Something was in the room with him. Something had just watched him. And then, suddenly, the communication link crackled to life again. Captain Wyatt, this is command. We've received your distress signal. Are you okay? His mouth went dry as he reached for the comlink. Negative. No signal from the ship's systems. Something is wrong. We need to leave now. But even as he spoke, the lights flickered one more time. And this time, they didn't come back. The shadow lingered, and he was no longer sure whether it was part of the ship or something else entirely. A voice echoed in his mind, faint and urgent. You shouldn't have come. And that was when Wyatt realized the ship had just made its move. The darkness in the room seemed to stretch beyond the walls, a tangible force wrapping around Wyatt as he stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what was happening. Comlink was still active, a faint crackle of static coming through, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the corner of the room where the shadow had been. His heart raced, every instinct telling him to run, but he couldn't move. His body felt like it was caught in a vice, the weight of something ancient and ominous pressing down on him. He forced himself to breathe, to think. The ship. The systems had activated on their own. The voice, unnatural, distorted, still echoed in his head, a constant reminder that something wasn't right. Wyatt's eyes darted around the observation deck, scanning the room, searching for any signs of life, anything that could explain what was happening. But there was nothing. The space was as still as it had ever been, yet the feeling of being watched lingered in the air like a suffocating fog. Captain Wyatt, do you copy? The voice from the comlink crackled again, this time louder, more insistent. Wyatt snapped out of his trance, his hand trembling slightly as he activated the link. This is Captain Wyatt. There's something wrong with the ship. The systems just rebooted and I'm not alone. The comlink crackled with static as a voice on the other end responded. We're receiving your signal, Captain. Please confirm your location. Wyatt glanced around the room again, trying to focus on the situation at hand, trying to push aside the growing sense of dread clawing at him. I'm in the observation deck. The ship's systems just rebooted on their own, and something's in here with me. Something I can't explain. It's like the ship is aware. We need to leave. Now. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a series of clicks and beeps. Then the voice came through again, this time more composed, more professional. Captain, we're running diagnostics on our end. We're not showing any signs of malfunction or intrusion. But if you're experiencing anything unusual, we suggest you make your way to the bridge. We'll initiate a full system scan from here. Wyatt's fingers tightened around the comlink, his frustration growing. I'm not imagining this. I can feel it, hear it. The ship's alive. It's doing something to us, something we don't understand. I need backup. Now. The voice on the comlink faltered for a moment before responding. Understood, Captain. Stay where you are. We'll send a team. Wyatt didn't wait for another word. The connection clicked off, and he was left in silence once again, the faint hum of the ship's systems the only sound. But the silence was oppressive, stifling. The sense of something lurking in the shadows, just out of reach, gnawed at him. He needed to move. But where? And to do what? He turned toward the door, his boots echoing softly against the metal floor as he made his way to the corridor. The air felt cooler now, the temperature dropping just enough to send a shiver down his spine. He knew the ship's climate control systems were functioning normally. He'd checked them himself before the mission began. Yet, here he was, walking through a seemingly ordinary ship that now felt like a haunted house. The walls, the floors, The very air seemed to pulse with something unseen, something foreign. The flicker of movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention again. Wyatt paused mid-step, his breath catching in his throat. There it was again, a shadow darting just beyond the edge of his vision. His pulse quickened. He hadn't imagined it this time. He turned sharply, but again, there was nothing. His mind raced. What was going on? Was it a malfunction in the ship's systems? But the sensors were showing no signs of irregularity. No strange readings. No signs of unauthorized access. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving, just outside the range of his sight, just beyond the limits of his understanding. He couldn't stand it any longer. He reached for the control panel beside the door, tapping in a few commands. The light above the door flickered once more before the console beeped to life. Security status, all systems normal. No anomalies detected. Wyatt cursed under his breath. The system was as calm as ever, as if nothing unusual was happening. But something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones. The ship was no longer just a vessel. It was something more, something that had taken on a life of its own. He turned and continued down the narrow corridor, his footsteps slow but purposeful. Every door he passed, every bulkhead felt like it was watching him. The lights overhead flickered again, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. A sudden chill ran down his spine, but he forced himself to keep moving. There was no time to waste. He needed answers. He needed to find out what was happening before it was too late. As he reached the central junction, Wyatt paused, glancing down the hallway that led to the bridge. He'd never felt so uneasy. He could almost hear the low hum of the ship's systems, the heartbeat of the vessel that had once been so comforting now felt like a warning. He stepped forward, his hand brushing against the cold metal of the wall as he moved toward the bridge. But before he could take another step, the door to the nearest control room slid open with a soft hiss, and a figure stepped out. Wyatt froze, his heart skipping a beat. The figure was dressed in the standard uniform of the ship's crew, but it wasn't anyone he recognized. The person's face was hidden by the shadows, their features obscured by the low light. "Captain Wyatt," the figure spoke, their voice low and hollow. It was a voice he didn't recognize, one that sent a shiver through him. There was something about the tone that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. "You shouldn't be here." Wyatt's breath caught in his throat as the figure stepped forward, the dim lighting revealing just enough to see the outline of their face pale, almost translucent, with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. The figure's movements were unnervingly fluid, like they were drifting through the air rather than walking. What are you?" Wyatt's voice came out rough, barely a whisper. He took a step back, his fingers instinctively reaching for the blaster at his hip, though he didn't draw it. He wasn't sure why. Something told him it wouldn't make a difference. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if studying him. "We are the ship." The words sent a jolt through Wyatt. The ship. The Nightfall. It was alive. It wasn't just a vessel. It had been alive all along, waiting for something waiting for him. He stumbled back a step, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure's eyes locked onto his, glowing faintly, and he could feel the weight of its gaze cold, alien, and unknowable. "You've disturbed the balance," the figure continued, its voice growing darker, more chilling. "You've woken it." Wyatt's mind raced, but he couldn't form a coherent thought. What balance? What had he woken? And more importantly, who was this thing standing in front of him? The figure reached out, its long fingers brushing the wall beside it. Wyatt's breath hitched as he watched, helpless as the wall seemed to react. Shifting, moving as though it were part of the figure itself. You shouldn't have come, Captain. Before Wyatt could speak, the lights in the corridor flickered again, this time with an intensity that made him squint. The figure was gone. The door to the control room slid shut, leaving nothing behind but an eerie silence. Wyatt stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He reached for the comm link on his wrist once more, his hands trembling as he activated it. "Command, do you copy?" he asked, his voice strained. There was no response. The comm link was dead. The ship was silent, save for the hum of its engines, which now seemed more like a growl, something deep and primal. He stood alone in the dark corridor, the weight of the silence pressing down on him, suffocating him. He had no idea what was happening, but he knew one thing for certain: there was something in this ship, something alive, something ancient. And it wasn't finished yet. Wyatt turned and walked toward the bridge, each step echoing in the silence. The ship was waiting. The unknown was waiting. And there was no turning back now. Wyatt's heart pounded as he moved down the dimly lit corridor, each step a reminder that the world he knew was slipping away, replaced by something far darker and more mysterious. The eerie hum of the ship, once a reassuring sound, now felt oppressive, like the pulse of an ancient beast, watching, waiting. The unsettling feeling of eyes on him lingered, though he knew he was alone, or at least he thought he was. He reached the bridge door and hesitated. For a moment, he considered turning back, trying to regroup, but the sinking feeling in his stomach told him there was no going back now. He had to confront whatever was happening head on. The unknown force on the ship was more than just an anomaly. It was a presence, and it was only a matter of time before it made its intentions clear. With a swift movement, he opened the door to the bridge. The usual array of consoles and blinking lights greeted him, but there was something different about it now. The air felt heavier, like the ship was holding its breath. Wyatt approached the central console, eyes scanning the screens, looking for anything out of the ordinary. Everything seemed normal, but he knew better than to trust appearances. "Captain, report," came a voice through his earpiece, crisp and professional, but with a hint of tension he hadn't noticed before. Wyatt's hand hovered over the console, unsure of how to begin. How could he explain the things he'd seen? The strange figure, the way the ship seemed to move on its own, like it had a mind of its own. Would they believe him, or would they think he'd lost his grip on reality? "I've encountered something on the ship. It's not a malfunction. It's alive, and it's affecting the systems." Wyatt's voice trembled slightly, despite himself. He clenched his jaw and pressed forward. "The ship itself, it's alive." There was a long pause on the other end, too long, before the voice responded. "Captain, we need you to clarify. We're getting standard readings from all systems. No irregularities. Are you sure there's no error in your analysis?" Wyatt's frustration mounted. He slammed his hand onto the console. "I'm telling you, it's not a glitch. Something is manipulating the ship, and I can feel it." He stood there, fists clenched, the room growing colder by the second. "You don't understand," he muttered to himself. "You don't know what I'm dealing with." Another voice broke in, one he recognized immediately, his second in command. "Captain, I've been reviewing the footage from the previous rooms you accessed. There's nothing on the monitors to support your claim. We've sent a crew down to check the systems, but so far, nothing is out of place." Wyatt couldn't hold back anymore. "You don't see what I see. This ship is different. It's doing things, moving things. I don't know how, but it's waking up." He paused, letting the words settle. "It's changing us. Changing everything." The silence on the other end was deafening. Wyatt took a step back from the console and rubbed his face, trying to gather his thoughts. He had been a captain long enough to know when something didn't feel right, and this felt like the calm before a storm. Every part of his being screamed at him to leave, but the ship, with its strange energy, held him here. There was no escaping the gravity of what was happening. The doors to the bridge slid open with a quiet hiss, and a figure entered. Wyatt's body went rigid, and his breath hitched. He spun around, half expecting the figure from before, the one who had claimed to be the ship, but it wasn't. It was one of the crew members, a technician. She looked uneasy, her eyes darting around the room as though she, too, could feel the suffocating presence of something watching them. "Captain, She stopped short when she saw his expression, his eyes wide, his hands shaking. She took a step back, as if sensing the tension in the air. "Is everything all right?" Wyatt's gaze locked onto her, and for the first time, he saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes, a reflection of his own growing fear. "No," he said quietly. "Nothing's all right." She didn't respond, but her eyes narrowed, and she slowly moved toward the nearest console, fingers hovering above it, as though expecting it to bite. A few seconds later, the lights flickered again, plunging them into near darkness. The hum of the ship grew louder, like the ship itself was taking a deep breath, preparing for something they weren't ready for. The technician's fingers flew over the console, but nothing changed. "Captain," she said, her voice barely audible over the rising hum. "I'm getting some strange data. It's not registering properly. Something's wrong with the system's communication." Wyatt's mind raced. The ship was responding, but to what? What had caused this disruption? Glanced over at the main console again, where the faint glow of the control systems now seemed to pulse in rhythm with the unnatural hum of the ship. And then, without warning, the voice came again soft, like a whisper in his ear, but it was everywhere. "The walls, the floor, the ceiling. You woke me." Wyatt's blood ran cold. He turned sharply, scanning the room for the source of the voice, but there was nothing. The technician looked just as confused, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" Wyatt's voice was barely a whisper. He didn't know if he was speaking to her or to the ship. He didn't know anymore. She shook her head, her face pale. "No, there's nothing. But there's a pattern. A strange signal." Wyatt stumbled backward as the reality of the situation hit him. It wasn't just the ship's systems malfunctioning. The ship was trying to communicate, trying to do something, perhaps something it had been planning for a long time. And they had disturbed it. As the hum of the ship grew louder, Wyatt turned back toward the central console. A new message was appearing on the screen, cryptic and garbled, almost like a code or language that wasn't meant for human eyes. He could only make out fragments. "Come awakening too late, escape none." Before he could process the message fully, the lights in the room blinked out completely, leaving them in complete darkness. Panic surged through Wyatt's veins, but before he could react, the technician screamed. A sound so sharp, so filled with terror, it made Wyatt's blood run cold. "Captain," she cried, voice cracking. "It's here. Something's here." Wyatt grabbed for the nearest flashlight, flicking it on with trembling hands. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the technician's face. Her eyes were wide with fear, and her breath came in ragged gasps. Her hands were trembling as she pointed toward the far corner of the room. Wyatt followed her gaze, heart pounding in his chest. There, in the corner of the room, a dark silhouette stood, motionless. The flashlight beam wavered, unable to reach it. The shape was shifting, distorting, like it didn't belong in the space around it. The voice whispered again, louder this time. "You cannot escape." Wyatt's instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet wouldn't move. His mind raced. Whatever was standing in the corner wasn't human. It wasn't even alive in the way they understood it. This was something ancient, something vast, something that had been waiting for them to cross its path. And now it was too late. The lights flickered back to life, just for a moment. And in that brief second, Wyatt saw it. The thing in the corner had moved closer, its outline shifting, more defined now. Its presence filled the room, pressing in on them, suffocating them. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the ship fell silent. The lights blinked back on, the hum of the systems returned to normal, and the figure was gone. But Wyatt knew it wasn't over. Whatever was in this ship, whatever had awoken, wasn't finished, and he didn't know how to stop it. The silence in the room felt suffocating. Wyatt stood frozen, staring at the spot where the figure had been just moments ago. His heartbeat drummed loudly in his ears as he scanned the empty space. The eerie hum of the ship had returned, low and constant, but it felt different now. Like the air was thicker, charged with something they couldn't see, but could all feel pressing down on them. Technician, still pale and shaking, slowly lowered her hands from where she'd been pointing. She looked at Wyatt, eyes wide, her face contorted in confusion and fear. What was that? Her voice trembled, almost unrecognizable from the calm, professional tone she usually carried. Was it real? Wyatt swallowed, forcing words past his dry throat. It was real, all right. But what it is, what it wants, we don't know yet. He glanced around the bridge, then quickly back at her. I need you to check all systems. Every backup, every secondary function. If this ship has anything like a manual override, we need to find it now. Her eyes flickered toward the console, and then back to him. You think it's still inside the ship, watching us? I don't think it ever left. Wyatt felt a cold shiver run down his spine as he spoke the words aloud. I don't think we're alone anymore. The technician moved slowly to the control panels, her movements hesitant. Wyatt could hear the sound of her fingers on the console, but the noise felt too small against the oppressive stillness. The soft glow of the buttons seemed almost to flicker in rhythm with the ship's hum, and every light, every screen that illuminated the room added to the sense that the ship was alive, aware, observing. Every few seconds, the air seemed to grow colder, and Wyatt couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, something beyond the walls of this place, something beyond the ship. A shift in the atmosphere, like the space around them was bending, warping. He reached for his communicator, but it was dead. The display was blank, the connection lost. Wyatt, it's not just us, the technician said, her voice barely audible, but laced with undeniable fear. She had found something that made her blood run cold. I've been scanning the ship's sublevels. There's movement. There are things down there, but they don't show up on any scans. They're invisible. A chill gripped Wyatt's chest. What are you talking about? Are they alive? I don't know. They shouldn't be, she replied, her voice trembling. They're too deep in the hull. It's like they're hiding in the shadows. I can't explain it. The air around Wyatt grew thick, oppressive, almost suffocating. It felt as though the ship itself was alive, conscious, aware of their presence, of him, of her. Something was stirring beneath the surface, beyond their reach, waiting for the right moment to strike. Wyatt's mind raced, but the connections eluded him. Everything that had happened so far, the figure in the corner, the strange voice, the malfunctions, felt like pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit together. But it was a puzzle he had no choice but to solve. Run a diagnostic on the engines, Wyatt barked, his voice firm now. "I need to know if we can get out of here, just in case." "Understood," she said, but her voice betrayed her uncertainty. She quickly moved to the engine diagnostics console, her fingers flying over the keys, her face illuminated by the harsh glow of the screen. Every so often, she would glance nervously over her shoulder, as though expecting something or someone to emerge from the shadows. Wyatt couldn't tear his eyes away from the dark corner where the figure had been. He still couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been there was still present in some form, lingering just out of sight. His thoughts raced as he replayed everything he had witnessed, trying to make sense of it, trying to predict what would come next. Then, without warning, the lights flickered again, dimming, then brightening in rapid succession, as though something was pulling power from the ship itself. The walls seemed to shift, and the once sturdy platform beneath his feet creaked ominously. "Captain!" The technician's voice cracked, filled with panic. I don't know how, but something's overriding the control systems. We can't stop it." Wyatt turned, his stomach dropping at the sight of the console flickering erratically. The ship was no longer responding to their commands. It was as if it had taken control. Something was inside, manipulating the very heart of the vessel. Suddenly, the walls of the bridge seemed to pulse, sending a ripple through the air. The floor beneath them vibrated, and Wyatt's hand gripped the edge of the console to steady himself. What the hell is happening? The technician had backed away from the console, staring at the ceiling now. Her breathing was rapid, her eyes wide with fear. It's the ship," she whispered. "It's speaking to us." Wyatt's heart skipped a beat. What? What are you talking about?" Her voice barely above a whisper, she said, the ship's voice. "It's in my head. I can hear it. It's calling." The hair on the back of Wyatt's neck stood on end, as he felt it too, like a cold draft running down his spine. He stepped back, suddenly aware of the silence that had settled around them, the oppressive stillness of the ship. Then the hum shifted again, this time in time with the rhythm of their breath. The voice wasn't loud, but it wasn't soft either. It was subtle, like it was carried on the very air they breathed, slipping through the walls of the ship into their minds. "You are here. You will serve." Wyatt's pulse quickened. The words weren't just a sound, they were a command. A force that had been waiting for them to make contact. Waiting for them to listen. He gritted his teeth, trying to fight the feeling, trying to push it out of his mind. "We need to get to the control room. Now." But the technician was no longer looking at him. Her eyes were vacant, her mouth slightly open, as though she was listening to something far away. She muttered, her voice eerily distant. "It's too late. It's already in us." Wyatt grabbed her by the arm and shook her, trying to snap her out of the trance. But she just stared past him, lost in whatever was taking over her mind. Then, without warning, the lights blinked off once more. This time, the darkness was absolute. A sudden cold flooded the room, and Wyatt felt his breath catch in his chest. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. And then, as if from nowhere, a scream filled the space. Not from the technician, not from him, but from the ship itself. The very walls screamed, the sound vibrating in the air, raw and primal, like an entity in agony. The ship was waking up, and they were the cause of it. "Get out!" Wyatt shouted, adrenaline surging as he pulled the technician towards the exit. But as his hand grasped the door control, the metal door remained sealed shut. The room began to shake violently, the walls creaking and groaning like something ancient was stirring deep within. A low, guttural noise rose from below, filling the entire ship with a sound that vibrated in their bones. The technician's eyes snapped to Wyatt, her expression one of sheer terror. "It's here," she whispered, her voice hollow. "It's alive. It's awake." Wyatt's throat tightened as the reality set in. Whatever was on this ship, whatever had taken control, was more than just a presence. It was something alive, something with a purpose. And now they were part of its plan. The cold metal of the door pulsed beneath Wyatt's hand, almost like it was breathing, but there was no time to waste on that strange sensation. The shaking had intensified, now matched by a deep rumbling sound that seemed to echo from every corner of the ship, coming from somewhere deep in the hull. It wasn't mechanical, it was primal, guttural, like the ship itself was in pain. Wyatt tried again to open the door, but it was useless. The ship's systems were locked down, and nothing he did seemed to have any effect. He looked back at the technician, whose eyes were now wide with something more than fear. Her gaze was fixed, distant, her lips moving in a whisper that wasn't meant for him. "It's inside us. All of us. It's spreading." Wyatt's heart skipped a beat as the pieces began to fall into place. He hadn't considered it before, but the way she spoke, so disconnected from reality, was it possible that whatever had taken hold of the ship was now reaching out, infecting the crew? His instincts screamed at him to get to the control room, but now that his mind was racing with the possibilities, the room felt smaller, more suffocating. The walls pressed in on him as if the very air was thickening, becoming harder to breathe. He turned back to the door and banged on it, his desperation growing. Come on," he shouted, willing the damn thing to open. But as his knuckles hit the panel once more, something shifted. The door didn't just open, it shattered, the metal flying outwards in a burst of sparks, a violent explosion of sound that was deafening in the otherwise silent room. For a moment, everything was still. Then the technician screamed this time. It wasn't the distant, disembodied sound of someone trapped in their own mind. This was real, raw terror. Wyatt spun around to see her backed up against the wall, her hands clutching her head as though she were being torn apart from the inside. The rumbling intensified, and Wyatt's heart slammed in his chest. He took a step toward her, but his foot didn't quite touch the ground. It hovered, just inches above the metal floor. His eyes widened as the room began to warp. The walls twisted, the shadows deepening, stretching toward him, trying to pull him in. The ship wasn't just alive, it was changing, adapting, as though it was becoming something else entirely. "Get out of here," the technician screamed, her voice no longer her own. It was distorted, a garbled, alien sound slipping from her throat. "It's too late. It's..." Her voice was cut off as the shadows surged forward, engulfing her in an instant. Wyatt lunged forward, his hand outstretched, but the moment his fingers brushed the darkness, it burned him. A white-hot pain shot up his arm, and he recoiled, feeling something deep inside him unravel. It wasn't just the ship anymore. Whatever had been inside it was reaching out, touching him, tearing at him. Panic surged, but Wyatt fought against it. He forced himself to focus, to think through the pain, to understand what was happening. The technician was gone, swallowed up by the darkness, her scream fading into the walls. And yet, the ship still hummed, alive, its pulse like the beating of a heart. Wyatt took a deep breath, trying to calm himself as the shadows shifted. This wasn't just a malfunction. This wasn't a typical ship issue. This was something far worse, something far more insidious. The air felt colder now, even though he could still feel the heat radiating from the burn on his arm. But it wasn't just cold. It was unnatural. It was the kind of cold that made you question your own breath. He forced his legs to move, taking another step forward, his mind racing. He had to get out. He had to stop this. But as he moved toward the exit, something shifted in the hallway. Another shape, another flicker in the darkness. Something watching him. Something moving just beyond his vision. He could see the shadows now, but they weren't just shadows. They were shifting, pulsating with something that wasn't quite right. They seemed to have a life of their own, a consciousness that was trying to reach him, to drag him back. Wyatt's chest tightened as he felt it again, the voice, the presence, the pulse in the air. The ship wasn't just alive, it was calling him. He turned to run, but something yanked him back, a sharp tug that felt like a force much stronger than anything he could have anticipated. He gasped for air as his body slammed against the cold metal walls. His head spun as the darkness crept closer, surrounding him, tightening its grip. "Get away from me," he shouted, trying to break free. But the ship wouldn't let him go. It was pulling him deeper, pulling him into its core. And then, in an instant, the walls stopped moving. The ship seemed to freeze, its hum silenced for a split second, leaving only the sound of his breath and the pounding of his heart in his ears. For a fleeting moment, everything felt. Then, without warning, the dark figure appeared again. Wyatt's pulse spiked. There, in front of him, standing in the heart of the darkness, was a figure tall, shadowed, its shape nothing like the human form. Its presence was alien in every sense of the word. Its eyes, or what should have been eyes, glowed faintly, their light an unsettling green that seemed to penetrate the shadows surrounding it. The figure spoke, its voice not one of sound, but of thought. "You are here, and you will join us." The words weren't a command, but a promise. And Wyatt realized, with horrifying clarity, that it wasn't just the ship that was alive. It was the very darkness itself. The ship had become a vessel for something else, something ancient, something beyond human comprehension. And now, it was inviting him to join it. His body froze as the words settled in. He tried to move, but the shadows closed in on him, tightening their grip around his chest, around his mind. The sensation was maddening. The voice was everywhere inside his head, inside his soul, trying to rip him apart, trying to make him a part of it. "Why?" he gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "What do you want from us?" The figure stepped forward, its form becoming more defined, more real, until it was standing inches away from him. It reached out with its long, skeletal hand, touching his shoulder. The coldness of it burned, but it was not a burn that would fade. It was a burn that would stay with him forever. "We want everything," it whispered. "We want you. You are a part of us now, and you will serve." Wyatt tried to scream, but the words never left his mouth. He couldn't move, couldn't fight it. His body was not his own. The shadows wrapped around him, and he felt himself being pulled deeper into their darkness, deeper into their world. The last thing he heard before everything went black was the voice, soft and insistent. "It's too late to escape. You are ours now." And then there was nothing. Wyatt's body convulsed in the darkness, his mind fractured by the weight of the shadows closing in. Every inch of him screamed to fight, but it felt as if the very air had turned to cement, solidifying around him. He was suspended in some cold, inescapable nightmare, unable to move or think. It wasn't just the physical sensation that overwhelmed him. It was the presence of something far more terrifying, something that gnawed at the edges of his consciousness, suffocating every thought with its insistent whisper. "We are one," the figure's voice continued to reverberate in his mind, a mantra he couldn't escape. "You will serve, like all before you." Coldness of its touch intensified, but there was something else of feeling deep inside, as if a part of him was fighting back. The darkness, which had once felt like an impenetrable force, now seemed to flicker, waver. The sense of being overwhelmed began to shift, just for a moment, and that moment was all Wyatt needed. His body trembled, his muscles strained, not from the physical torment, but from an unyielding will to survive. It was buried deep within him, this fight, this defiance. The shadows had claimed his mind, but his spirit had not given in. Not yet. Not completely. With a force he didn't understand, he willed his hand to move. He reached up, fingers brushing against the shadows wrapping around him, and as he touched them, something unexpected happened. Instead of being consumed, the darkness recoiled, retreating like it was repelled by his touch. The air buzzed with tension, as if the ship itself was holding its breath. The figure, its form still towering over him, faltered. Its glowing eyes blinked, a flicker of doubt passing through the ethereal being. "No," it whispered, as if it had just realized something it hadn't expected. You are not one of us." Wyatt didn't have time to process its words. His body, seemingly acting of its own accord, surged forward, breaking free from the hold of the shadows. He forced himself to stand, trembling but determined. The ship, the entity, the unexplainable darkness, it had tried to take him, to claim him, but Wyatt wasn't going to surrender. Not now. He felt the sudden surge of power, the hum of energy pulsing beneath his feet, through his limbs. It wasn't just his own strength. It was something within the ship itself, something older, buried deep within the metal and machinery. It was as if the ship had recognized him, recognized the fight inside of him. The very walls of the ship, the flickering shadows, the voice that had taunted him, it all began to tremble, as if it were on the edge of collapse. But before he could make another move, the ship's lights flashed. The hum of the energy around him stopped, and everything went still. The figure before him, the one that had seemed so sure of its victory, suddenly froze. Its eyes, once glowing brightly, dulled, and it staggered back, its form flickering like a fading hologram. Wyatt took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The shadows that had once enveloped him now seemed to shrink away, retreating, as if someone had just claimed dominance over them. The room around him seemed to shift, the walls groaning under the pressure. But the voice that had haunted him, began to fade. Not retreat, not vanish, just fade. As though its connection to the ship was weakening. We were wrong," the voice murmured, its tone now unrecognizable. You are something else." Wyatt's breath caught in his throat as the shadows continued to retreat. The figure that had once towered over him dissolved into the darkness, its presence no longer a threat, but a fading memory. Whatever had claimed the ship, whatever had tried to pull him into its grasp, was now losing its hold. But as the shadows continued to flicker and die out, a different kind of tension settled in. The ship's rumbling had stopped. The air no longer felt thick or oppressive. It was almost silent, too silent. Then, without warning, the walls shook violently. Wyatt barely had time to react as the entire ship seemed to shift beneath him, as if the vessel itself had come to life. The floor beneath him cracked, and a deep, guttural sound, like the roar of an ancient creature awakening from a long slumber, echoed through the corridors. The lights flickered once more, this time erratically, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. Wyatt stumbled, trying to regain his footing. This wasn't over. Whatever had been inside the ship was still alive, and now it was angry. Furious. And then he heard it. A voice, a new voice, not one that had spoken to him before. It was cold, commanding, and full of authority. "You are too late," the voice said, echoing across the vast, empty halls. You think you have defeated me? You are nothing but a pawn in a much larger game. Wyatt's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't the entity that had been controlling the ship. It was something else, something far older. And it was now speaking directly to him. The ship began to tremble once more, but this time it wasn't just the vibrations of malfunctioning systems. This was different. The sound was deeper, as if something vast and powerful was rising from beneath, pulling everything in its wake. Wyatt's mind raced. What the hell is going on? He muttered, barely able to process the situation. He had fought to survive. He had broken free from whatever had tried to claim him. But now, there was something even more dangerous rising. The ship's systems came online with a sudden, violent surge. Lights flickered back on in rapid bursts, and the air seemed to pulse with energy. The walls groaned and shifted as if they were being rearranged, reconfigured. But this wasn't a mechanical failure. This was intentional. Before Wyatt could react, a new set of readings appeared on his console. His breath caught as he scanned the display. The numbers were off the charts, far beyond anything he had ever encountered. The ship was shifting, but it wasn't just moving. It was changing, transforming, adapting. It was becoming something other. A roar, deafening in its intensity, ripped through the corridors. Wyatt's heart raced. Whatever had been controlling the ship was no longer hiding in the shadows. It was coming for him. But then, in the midst of the chaos, something unexpected happened. The ship's rumbling stopped. The lights stabilized. The air cleared. And in the silence that followed, Wyatt realized something. The ship wasn't transforming into a weapon. It was transforming into a portal. A portal to somewhere else. Somewhere beyond. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, and Wyatt felt a chill run down his spine. Whatever had been controlling the ship, whatever had tried to destroy him, had been trying to open a doorway. A doorway to another world. The voice spoke again, this time softer, almost a whisper. You've done well to survive. But now, you will see the truth. And before Wyatt could respond, the lights flickered once more, and everything went black. The darkness consumed him completely. Wyatt felt a heavy weight press against him, the sensation of being submerged underwater. Time itself seemed to stretch and distort, his mind swimming in a haze of confusion and fear. His senses blurred, and it was as if he could no longer tell where his body ended and the darkness began. It was cold, colder than he had ever experienced, like the very marrow of his bones had frozen. But through the cold, something tugged at his consciousness, pulling him toward the light. A soft, flickering glow began to emerge from the periphery of his vision. It wasn't a typical light. It was strange, alien, almost alive. Wyatt reached out, drawn to it, his fingers trembling. As he moved toward it, he felt the heavy fog lifting from his mind, the pressing weight of the darkness easing up just enough for him to gain a sense of clarity. He gasped for breath as the light surrounded him, pulling him fully from the depths of the shadow. His vision cleared, and he found himself standing once more, only this time, not in the sterile, metallic halls of the ship, but in a vast, open space. The surroundings were not what he had expected. The air smelled different, thicker, almost otherworldly. The walls that once confined him had vanished, replaced by an expanse of shimmering blue light that stretched infinitely in every direction. The portal, it seemed, had opened. But where had it taken him? Wyatt's pulse quickened as he scanned his surroundings. He couldn't explain it, but this place, this realm, felt both familiar and foreign at the same time. The very fabric of reality seemed to bend around him. There were no stars, no celestial bodies, just an endless stretch of glowing blue and black, swirling together like the canvas of an unformed universe. In the distance, an enormous structure appeared to float. It looked like something between a ship and a fortress, its design so far removed from anything Wyatt had ever seen that it made his mind reel. The ship, the black ship, had brought him here, but now it was nothing more than a faint memory. Whatever the ship had become, whatever it had transformed into, it no longer mattered. Wyatt had crossed the threshold into something far greater, something beyond his understanding. And yet, that whisper, that voice, still echoed in his mind. It was faint, like a breeze brushing against his ear, but it was unmistakable. You've done well to survive. But now you will see the truth. The words sent a chill down his spine, but there was no time to dwell on them. He had no choice but to move forward. He didn't know what awaited him in this new, surreal reality, but he was past the point of fear. His only option was to push ahead and find answers. He stepped forward, the air around him shimmering as if reacting to his every movement. Each step felt like it carried him closer to the truth, to whatever had been pulling the strings all along. He was no longer a pawn, he was a player in a game he could scarcely comprehend, a game with rules that didn't adhere to anything he had known. Yet he felt something stirring within him, a force stronger than mere survival, a need for knowledge, for understanding. As he approached the distant structure, the ground beneath his feet seemed to shift, growing unstable, and then solidifying again, as if reacting to his presence. The air hummed, vibrating with energy. It was the same kind of energy he had felt before, the unnatural, alien energy that seemed to resonate from deep within the ship, now amplified here, in this strange place. Suddenly, without warning, the structure before him began to change. Its surface rippled, warping as if it were a living entity, its very material shifting like liquid. And then, in a flash of light, it solidified into something entirely different, a doorway, or an archway, standing tall and imposing. The entrance beckoned, its shape so perfectly symmetrical that it almost felt intentional. Wyatt stepped closer, the sense of unease still gnawing at him, but with it, an undeniable curiosity. What lay beyond? What was this place? And more importantly, who or what was waiting for him on the other side? He didn't have time to answer these questions. He couldn't afford to wait, to wonder. The door, the archway, it was there. He had to take the next step. Without looking back, he entered. The transition was instantaneous. One moment, he was standing in front of the archway. The next, he was standing in a vast chamber. The walls of this new place were a mix of organic and metallic, the surface appearing like the skin of some enormous creature, both solid and fluid at once. It pulsed with life, with energy, and Wyatt's breath caught in his throat. At the center of the chamber stood a being tall, humanoid, but not entirely human. Its skin shimmered like liquid silver, its eyes glowing with an intense, otherworldly light. The being was surrounded by a faint aura of power, its presence overwhelming and yet oddly calm. Its gaze fixed on Wyatt, and for a moment, the air felt thick with the weight of its attention. "You've come," the being said, its voice like the hum of 1,000 voices speaking in unison, yet somehow still distinctly clear. "I had wondered when you would arrive." Wyatt's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. He had so many questions, but all of them seemed insignificant in the face of this entity. "Where am I?" he asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "This place," the being said, its voice reverberating in the chamber, is the nexus. The point where all things converge, where realities intersect, where the truths of existence are laid bare. Wyatt's mind spun as he tried to process the words. The nexus? But what does that mean? What's happening here? What do you want with me? The being tilted its head, a strange and almost human gesture, though it was still so foreign. I do not want anything from you, it said. I have no need. You were never meant to come here, but the ship your ship, it changed. It brought you to me, to us. You have been chosen, though I do not know why. The sense of dread that had hung over Wyatt began to shift, replaced by something more profound curiosity, but also uncertainty. He was not a mere spectator anymore. He had been pulled into this unknown world for a reason, but he still didn't understand the full scope of it. Why me? Wyatt asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. What's so special about me? Why was I able to survive when others? The being's eyes seemed to soften, the glow fading slightly. You are not special, it said, its tone almost pitying. You are part of something much older, a part of the story that began long before your time, long before the ship ever existed. You have always been connected to this place, this nexus, though you have never known it. Until now. Wyatt felt the ground beneath him shift once more. The walls, the energy, the very air, it was all vibrating with an intensity he couldn't comprehend. It was as if the truth was beginning to break free, to reveal itself in pieces that his mind couldn't yet grasp. This isn't real, Wyatt said, the words tumbling out in disbelief. None of this makes sense. I don't understand what you're saying. The being's gaze softened, and for the briefest moment, it almost seemed empathetic. It is not for you to understand yet. You will in time. But first, you must see. And with that, the chamber around him seemed to dissolve. The walls, the being, it all faded away, replaced by a new scene. Suddenly, Wyatt was standing in the middle of an expansive battlefield. The sky above was a churning mass of energy, and the ground beneath him was scorched, cracked, and bleeding with strange unknown colors. The air was thick with the sound of war, the clash of weapons, the screams of battle. He wasn't alone. Figures surrounded him, humanoid but distorted, their features both human and alien in ways he couldn't comprehend. They fought not just with physical strength, but with energy forces that defied the very laws of nature. Look, the voice of the being echoed once again, though it no longer came from the entity. Instead, it came from everywhere and nowhere at once. This is the history of your kind. The beginning. The end. The war that shaped your universe, that shaped all universes. The battle for control, for survival, for existence itself. Wyatt's mind struggled to comprehend what he was seeing. He watched, helpless, as the figures clashed, their bodies morphing and shifting with the violence of the battle. Some wielded weapons of unimaginable power, while others used sheer will and force to shape reality around them. This, the voice continued, was your origin. Your purpose, the reason why the ship found you, the reason you were able to survive. Wyatt could feel the weight of it all pressing down on him, the knowledge, the weight of the past, and the burden of what was to come. But even as he struggled to grasp the enormity of what he was witnessing, something stirred inside of him. The power, the energy, the potential to shape and reshape, to survive, to fight, to push against impossible odds. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The battlefield faded away, replaced by a stillness that was even more overwhelming than the chaos. Wyatt, was left standing alone once more, the weight of the truth pressing down on him like a heavy cloak. The being's voice returned, soft, almost resigned. You are not meant to be here, but you are here nonetheless. The ship has brought you to this moment, to this realization. And now, you must choose. Wyatt's mind reeled as the final realization dawned on him. This wasn't just about survival. It wasn't about escaping the shadows or fighting the darkness. It was about understanding, about becoming something more than human, something greater, something connected to the very fabric of reality itself. And as the vision of the battlefield faded into the distant reaches of his mind, Wyatt knew what he had to do. But the question was, would he choose to embrace it? Or would he turn his back on the destiny the ship had thrust upon him? Only time would tell. But for now, the truth had been revealed. And with it, Wyatt's journey had only just begun.